Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
This personal issue that cropped up that ruined his career at the end, I think, is very much a minor thing as a historian, I have to say, compared to, his big exploits in Iraq and Afghanistan.
As CIA Director David Petraeus steps down after confessing to an extramarital affair with his biographer, we speak with historian Juan Cole about Petraeus's role in Iraq and Afghanistan, then the CIA. Then the nation marks Veterans Day.
In this country, we take care of our own, especially our veterans who have served us so bravely and sacrificed so selflessly in our name. And we carry on knowing that our best days always lie ahead.
Yet a major new investigation by journalist Aaron Glantz reveals how thousands of veterans are being denied disability benefits due to errors by the Department of Veterans Affairs.
There's not nearly enough resources, and the amount of accumulated trauma that these soldiers, Marines, and airmen are experiencing because of the war itself continues to accumulate the longer the war goes on, and the military is playing catch-up.
More than 67,000 veterans are homeless. An estimated 18 veterans commit suicide every day. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The New York Times is reporting high-level officials at the FBI and Justice Department were notified in late summer about the extramarital affair that prompted CIA Director David Petraeus to resign on Friday. The relationship between Petraeus and his biographer Paula Broadwell was uncovered during an FBI investigation into harassing emails allegedly sent by Broadwell to another woman. Members of Congress have complained they were not informed of the FBI's findings until just after the election. As head of the CIA, Petraeus oversaw the agency's use of drones for targeted killings abroad and had recently pushed the White House to approve a major expansion of the agency's drone fleet. Petraeus also directed the so-called surge of troops in Iraq under President George W. Bush and later commanded U.S. and coalition forces in Afghanistan. In a letter to the CIA workforce on Friday, Petraeus said of the extramarital affair, quote, "Such behavior is unacceptable both as a husband and as the leader of an organization such as ours." We'll have more on General Petraeus after headlines. In news from Afghanistan, a British soldier has been shot dead in an apparent insider attack by an individual wearing an Afghan army uniform. International forces returned fire, killing a member of the Afghan army, though it was unclear whether the man they killed was the original shooter. The incident followed an attack by 2 Afghan soldiers Saturday that injured a Spanish service member. More than 60 soldiers with the U.S.-led NATO coalition have been killed so far this year amidst a surge in attacks by Afghan colleagues. Meanwhile, 10 Afghan civilians died in 3 separate roadside bomb attacks over the weekend. The dead included a family returning home from a hospital with their newborn baby. More than a dozen Afghan witnesses and victims testified over the weekend as part of a hearing to determine whether U.S. Staff Sergeant Robert Bales will face a court-martial for allegedly slaughtering 16 Afghan civilians in March. In harrowing video testimony transmitted to a courtroom at Fort Base Lewis McChord, the witnesses, including several children, recalled being shot at and seeing their loved ones murdered. One young witness remembered shouting, quote, "We are children, before seeing his sister get shot. President Obama marked Veterans Day Sunday at Arlington National Cemetery outside Washington, D.C. During his address, Obama touted the drawdown of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan.
This is the first Veterans Day in a decade in which there are no American troops fighting and dying in Iraq. 33,000 of our troops have now returned from Afghanistan, and the transition there is underway. After a decade of war, our heroes are coming home. And over the next few years, more than 1 million service members will transition back to civilian life.
Obama's speech focused heavily on the need to provide services to recent veterans, almost a quarter of whom come home physically or emotionally disabled. But an investigation by ProPublica and the Seattle Times recently found the U.S. military has lost or destroyed records that are needed for veterans to claim benefits. We'll have more on the challenges faced by veterans later in the broadcast. The group Veterans for Peace joined one of the country's largest Veterans Day parades in Auburn, Washington, Saturday, after the group was initially barred from participating by the city. The pro-peace group filed a discrimination lawsuit and was allowed to march after a judge issued a temporary restraining order. The issue of tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans has taken center stage in the political battle over a looming fiscal cliff of tax increases and spending hikes that could tip the country into an economic recession at the start of next year. The New York Times reports Obama is hoping to recruit corporate executives to pressure Republicans to accept higher taxes in exchange for assurances of Democratic votes to reduce so-called entitlements like Medicare and Medicaid. On Saturday, President Obama defended tax hikes for the wealthy.
I'm open to compromise and new ideas, but I refuse to accept any approach that isn't balanced. I will not ask students or seniors or middle-class families to pay down the entire deficit, while people making over $250,000 a year aren't asked to pay a dime more in taxes.
Republican House Speaker John Boehner, meanwhile, argued against any tax hikes as part of a deal to avoid the so-called fiscal cliff.
Instead of raising tax rates on the American people and accepting the damage it will do to our economy, let's start to actually solve the problem. Now let's focus on tax reform that closes special interest loopholes and lowers tax rates. Instead of accepting arbitrary cuts that will endanger our national defense, let's get serious about shoring up the entitlement programs that are the primary drivers of our country's massive growing debt.
In Haiti, torrential rains and devastating floods have killed at least 11 people and left thousands homeless in recent days, just 2 weeks after Haiti was devastated by Hurricane Sandy. Rivers have overflowed, crops have been destroyed, and aid workers say they're in dire need of supplies.
We have about 150 people here with only 12 sacks of bread. They gave us 4 cases of juice since this morning. Also, the World Food Program brought 2 packs of cookies for each and every one. We have handicapped people here, babies, even women that gave birth here last night. That means we don't have anything for them.
The New York region, meanwhile, is continuing its slow recovery from Superstorm Sandy. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo plans to ask the federal government for at least $30 billion in disaster aid to help repair bridges, tunnels, and public transit and meet other costs. Officials say the storm caused more than $50 billion in damages to the New York region, making it the country's costliest storm apart from Hurricane Katrina. More than 125,000 customers remain without power in New York and New Jersey Sunday, the vast majority of them on Long Island and the Rockaways. On Saturday, hundreds of people protested outside LIPA, the Long Island Power Authority, condemning the utility's slow response to the outages. Escalating clashes between Israeli forces and Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have led to some of the worst violence the area has seen in months. Human rights activists say 7 Palestinians have been killed, including 5 civilians, while more than 50 others have been wounded. The group Palestinian Center for Human Rights said 4 of the deaths occurred when the Israeli military fired an artillery shell on young people who were playing football. A number of Israelis have been wounded by Palestinian rockets and mortar. Tensions between the two sides escalated after a young Palestinian boy was shot dead last week during an exchange of fire with Israelis. In news from Syria, groups opposed to the regime of President Bashar al-Assad have agreed to form a unity coalition and elected cleric Muaz al-Khatib as its leader. The decision comes amidst mounting violence between Assad's regime and rebel forces. Officials with the United Nations Refugee Agency say 11,000 Syrians fled to Turkey and other neighboring countries over a 24-hour period at the end of last week. More than 400,000 Syrian refugees are now registered with the UN. Meanwhile, Sunday, Israel fired a guided missile into Syria in what they said was a warning shot after mortar fire from Syrian fighting spilled over into the Golan Heights. In the Basque region of Spain, residents of the town of Baracaldo held a vigil Friday to pay homage to a 53-year-old woman who jumped from a balcony to her death as she was about to be evicted. The death of Amaya Igana marked the second suicide in 2 weeks related to evictions in Spain, after a growing mass movement has put pressure on the authorities to act. Spain's government and opposition leaders were expected to meet Monday to work on changes to the country's mortgage laws, which critics say favor banks and fail to cancel debt even after homes are repossessed. Spain has seen a mounting economic crisis with unemployment now exceeding 25%. A general strike in Spain has been called for Wednesday. Greece, meanwhile, has passed a new austerity budget for next year amidst mass protests over spending cuts and tax hikes. Ahead of the vote Sunday, some 15,000 anti-austerity demonstrators gathered outside Parliament. Protesters condemned European leaders who've demanded Greek cuts in exchange for an international bailout.
This is a budget that will bleed the Greek people dry. It is so that they can pay for the capital of the banks and the markets. That's why I'm here, so I can shout at this oligarchic government and the political elite, as well as the oligarchs of Europe, that enough is enough.
The Director General of the British Broadcasting Corporation has resigned amidst mounting questions over the BBC's handling of 2 child sex abuse reports. Earlier this month, one of the BBC's flagship programs, Newsnight, broadcast a report that wrongly implicated a politician in child sex abuse claims. After the report aired, the victim saw a photograph of the politician, said he was not the man who abused him. In his resignation speech on Saturday, former BBC Director General George Entwistle admitted the report reflected poor journalistic standards.
In light of the fact that the Director General is also the Editor-in-Chief and ultimately responsible for all content, and in light of the unacceptable journalistic standards of the Newsnight film broadcast on Friday, 2nd November, I have decided that the honourable thing to do is to step down from the post of Director General.
Newsnight is also under scrutiny for failing to broadcast a report on child sex abuse allegations against the popular BBC personality Jimmy Savile, who is accused of abusing potentially hundreds of victims. There were reports the BBC's news director and her deputy have also quit over the scandal. A California woman has been fired from her job after using a racial slur against President Obama on Facebook and writing, quote, "Maybe he will get assassinated this term." 22-year-old Denise Helms later explained her comments in a news interview.
The assassination part is kind of harsh, and I'm not saying like I would go do that or anything like that by any means, but if it was to happen, I don't think I would care one bit.
The post by Denise Helms was part of a barrage of racist references to President Obama on social media following his re-election last week. Republican Congressmember and Tea Party favorite Allen West is refusing to concede his re-election fight against Democratic challenger Patrick Murphy, even though the state of Florida says he lost by more than 2,000 votes. That margin is less than the number needed to trigger an automatic recount, but election officials in one county are reportedly recounting some early votes. On Friday, a Florida judge denied a request by Congressmember West to impound ballots and voting machines. The Supreme Court has announced it'll hear a challenge to a key provision of the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965. The case centers on a section of the law that requires many state and local governments with a history of voting-related discrimination to get federal approval before altering voting procedures. Recently, the law has been used by courts to block voter ID requirements in attempts to curb early voting. The money transfer company MoneyGram has agreed to establish a $100 million compensation fund as part of a government settlement over fraud allegations. The company is accused of processing transfers to MoneyGram agents who defrauded customers by posing as family members or offering cash prizes. The Justice Department said thousands of MoneyGram customers complained, but the company failed to fire the agents it knew were involved. MoneyGram also admitted it failed to maintain an effective anti-money laundering program in violation of federal law. And the openly queer and HIV-positive activist, artist, writer, and poet Brandon Lacy Campos has died at the age of 35. Campos wrote widely about race, sexuality, and his experience living with HIV. In a speech earlier this year at the Civil Liberties and Public Policy Conference at Hampshire College, he called for HIV to be a central concern of the movement for reproductive freedom.
Let me be clear, HIV isn't over. It's relevant to your work. It's relevant to your lives. It is not just a disease that affects white gay men. It isn't a disease that impacts only men of color on the down low. In fact, it isn't a disease that impacts only men. Women, and specifically women of color, and even more specifically African American and Latina women, are the fastest growing population of people living with HIV. And with 300,000 women living with HIV in the United States, and women representing more than 50% of HIV cases around the world, you cannot in justice or in faith remove issues of HIV from reproductive justice.
Brandon Lacy Campos has died at the age of 35. He was found in New York City on Friday. It was unclear how he died. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.